Can Games Workshop win back the old Warhammer Fantasy players with The Old World? Or have Games Workshop simply burned too many bridges? And really, the interesting question to me is, does the old world actually need the old players, or will it get enough new players for it not to be relevant? Let's talk about it. So without explaining in massive detail, Warhammer Fantasy Battle was an old Games Workshop game, and it was a relatively niche game, but it was loved by a lot of its players, and probably not loved by some of its players as well. And then, after the game's 8th edition, Games Workshop decided for whatever reason that they were going to effectively end the game and replace it with Warhammer The Age of Sigmar, and they went in a completely new direction. Fantasy was dead, the Age of Sigmar was reborn via the end times, and the game obviously changed a lot. Square bases were out, rank and file was gone, and just overall, Age of Sigmar is a very different game to Warhammer Fantasy, right? And importantly, a lot of players felt like their existing armies were not going to be any use in the new game. They were effectively being phased out. Yes, you could actually use them, but they weren't going to be as powerful or as relevant as what a new army would be in the Age of Sigmar. You could look at the Golden Boys, the Stormcast Eternals, and you sort of knew that this was a very different game. And this caused a lot of players to be angry. The armies that people had poured a lot of time and effort into were now going to be effectively redundant. And don't forget, they'd also spent a lot of money on their models at the same time. I think one guy famously burned his entire Warhammer Fantasy army, which was just literally burning money, but it is what it is. People were definitely, though, not happy. And some people are still not happy. I've had comments in my videos saying that they are definitely not going to play the old world because of the treatment of Warhammer Fantasy. And you know what? I actually think that that is a completely understandable position. And really, it's hard to disagree with people's feelings. If you feel that way, then that's fine. But then the question is, how many of the old Warhammer Fantasy players will Games Workshop win back? Well, I know they're definitely going to win back at least one player because you're looking at him right now. But if people are true to their words, then they're not going to win back everybody. Now, with all due respect to the people who are saying they're going to boycott Warhammer The Old World, a bit of me thinks that once they see the new models that we get from Games Workshop, Forge World, or wherever they come from, then they may end up quickly changing their minds. Let's face it, Games Workshop are going to produce some stunning models, and it's going to be really tempting for those players. After all, if you enjoyed the way that the game used to look, the lore, and everything associated with it, are you really going to pass up the opportunity to relive that fun and experience a new dawn of Warhammer The Old World? Some will hold fast against the Games Workshop tyranny, but I think some will cave in and buy into the game. So the answer is sort of yes, they're obviously going to win back some players, and some players say that they won't. Okay, that's understandable. But I also think that Games Workshop know that there'll be players like me who I wasn't really that into Warhammer Fantasy. I never went to tournaments or anything like that. We were just playing with friends. They'll know that maybe I have a little bit more disposable cash than what I did when I was at university. I want it, basically, and they'll know that. Games Workshop will know that, and they'll know that a lot of the players who used to play it will still be tempted back. Then there's the bigger question, which is, do Games Workshop even need to win back the old Warhammer Fantasy players? I'm not so sure. Firstly, Games Workshop marketing now is a lot better than what it used to be. A lot of people are just going to see the hype train and join in the hype train because the models are going to look great. They'll see the shiny new toys and they'll just not be able to resist. But secondly, we have the Total War video games, which may bring in a completely fresh group of players into Warhammer The Old World and the hobby in general. Because if you don't know, Total War Warhammer is a series of like real-time strategy games which are seriously quite popular. And some people, probably myself included to some extent, think that Total War Warhammer is one of the reasons they're actually bringing back the old world in the first place. However, I think it's the games, the IP and more, but we'll not talk about that here. But yeah, we have some seriously popular video games. And yes, a $60 video game is vastly different from the several $100 tabletop war game that we would actually have to buy in if you want to go from a video game to a tabletop game. You know, it's a drastic increase in time and effort and stuff like that. I get that. But apparently the Total Warhammer games have sold over 36 million copies. And if just 1% of that player base decides to join into the tabletop hobby, that's 360,000 new players that could be available. Now, obviously, that's just an estimated percentage, and that 36 million is for the series as a whole, so there'll be actually several people who are counted multiple times as they buy multiple versions of the game because it's had sequels and stuff like that. But the overall point is the numbers could get really bonkers if just a small percentage of video game players decide to join in to the tabletop hobby. And that's just one game. Vermintide is another example of a very popular video game that could bring players into the tabletop version. I think inevitably Games Workshop will have burned too many bridges for some players, but we'll have a completely new batch of wargamers who weren't even wargamers when Warhammer Fantasy died. They weren't around for fantasy, therefore they don't share that sort of pain. And of course we'll have some old fantasy players returning, and I think we might even get players who are just fed up of Warhammer 40k who maybe look at Age of Sigmar and think that's more of the same but in a fantasy setting, those players might say, hey, no harm trying Warhammer The Old World. And obviously ultimately I think we might get some video game players who sort of are a new to the hobby kind of group. I think Games Workshop basically look behind them and they see those burned bridges, but you know what, I think they just look ahead and they realize that they can just build more bridges for more players. However, there's actually no guarantee that those bridges won't get burned again, but that's another topic for another day, I believe. So let's do this. Let's get everybody who says that they will boycott Warhammer The Old World because of the treatment of Warhammer Fantasy, you guys and girls get in the comments and just say that, and then what we'll maybe do when the game actually comes out, we'll maybe come back to this video, reply to these comments and see how many of you bought into the new game or how many didn't. Who will be able to admit that they said they were going to boycott and then didn't, and who will hold fast against that GW tyranny and just never buy in. A bit of me thinks though that if people are commenting on videos about Warhammer The Old World without the intent of getting in, you're probably quite likely to actually succumb and buy in because there's still obviously some interest there. Are you going to really let the GW history put you off having potential fun? Well, we'll find out, shall we? Everybody else, do you think that the video games will actually create any kind of like sensible interest in the tabletop war game, or do you think that's a bit of a stretch? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What I do hope you all do is have a most beautiful day, like and subscribe. Goodbye.